South Africa is in a national state of disaster due to the country's drawn-out energy crisis. The country has endured rolling blackouts since 2008, and 2022 saw twice as many as in previous years. The problem of reliable energy is not unique to South Africa. According to the Africa Development Bank, over 640 million Africans have no access to electricity, which means Africa has the lowest energy access rate in the world. This week on the program, we examine why the continent with the greatest renewable energy potential is struggling to meet its energy needs and what can be done to remedy this. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Electricity powers many aspects of our daily lives. Affordable and reliable energy reduces the cost of doing business, unlocks economic potential, and creates jobs. In Africa, insufficient energy access manifests itself in hundreds of thousands of deaths annually due to smoke emitted from traditional cooking stoves, handicaps the operations of hospitals and emergency services, compromises education, and drives up the cost of doing business. Energy access for all is therefore one of the key drivers of inclusive growth as it creates opportunities for women, youth and children both in urban and rural areas. Now, Africa's energy potential, especially renewables, is enormous. Yet, only a fraction of it is being currently exploited. Hydropower provides around a fifth of current capacity, but not even a tenth of its total potential is being utilized. Similarly, the technical potential of solar, biomass, wind and geothermal energy is huge, but lies largely untapped. Well, joining me now to unpack the current status of Africa's energy sector are from Johannesburg, Vincent Obisi Olu, Natural Resource Governance Researcher at Good Governance Africa. From Nairobi, Patrick Tonui, Head of Policy and Regional Strategy at the Global Association for the Off-Grid Solar Energy Industry. And from New York, Mark Rossano, Founder and CEO, C6 Capital Holdings, a multi-sector investment and consulting firm. Gentlemen, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us today. Vincent, if I may start off with you, because South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has declared a national state of disaster over his country's crippling power shortages. What's going on in South Africa's energy sector?
Thank you so much for having me, Beatrice. The first issue that we have in South Africa is that majority of our power comes from the state utility Eskom. Now, Eskom makes most of its power from coal, and not only is it, a lot of the grid has been underserviced and undermaintained. So we have an aging fleet of coal power plants that have not received sufficient maintenance. We have legacy issues of corruption, maladministration, and incompetence in some ways.
So you're talking about unmaintained infrastructure here, but because about 77% of South Africa's primary energy needs are provided by coal, and the country at the moment is facing a huge energy deficit. Is the country making any effort, though, to diversify this energy portfolio?
Yes, we are. So we do have one nuclear power plant named Blueberg. We also have a policy called the Renewables Independent Power Producers Program, in which private sector actors are coming in with renewable energy to put electrons onto the grid. We also have a policy towards increasing the share of renewable power created. We even have an administrative drive towards green hydrogen in the country. So there are policies and things put in place, but the primary issue that we need to really address is grid capacity. Without having effective grid capacity, we cannot effectively have any new electrons run to the grid.
Patrick, Kenya has a different story. Let's talk about that for a minute, because over 80% of Kenya's electricity is generated from renewable or clean energy sources. That is according to Kenya's energy regulator, IPRA. And the country is saying it wants to go fully green energy by 2030. What is Kenya's policy and energy mix here?
So I think right now you'd find that in Kenya, going back to 2019 and previously, there's been a very big concerted effort to take advantage of the natural resources that are here. And particularly, I think you'll see the contribution of the geothermal has increased is quite significantly over the past decade. And also more and more, you're seeing more renewables come, wind and solar. I think if you look today as Kenya's energy access picture, for example, while the main grid itself is providing about just under 60% of energy access to Kenyans who are connected. The country reports close to 80%, and of that 80%, most of that is provided, the balance is provided by the private sector, who are primarily leveraging solar solutions. So solar solutions in terms of the investment and the ability to bring it affordably, either through distributed solutions or through the mini grids, really is this the right solution at the right price to meet the right application, whereas particularly the grid is not available. And then the government on its side, also with integrated electrification approach, has really been able to mainstream this ecosystem that's allowing us to the picture that we are today.
So take us back to the 1990s, because according to the World Bank, at that time, Kenya barely had 1 million people on the national grid, barely 1 million having electricity. But that has changed by 2021. We are talking about 71%. So how has Kenya achieved this?
So I think with a lot of support from development partners, I think like the World Bank and others, if you go back even to 2009 and 2010, there was this very significant recognition that you needed to bring everybody onto an electricity access. And that's when they first set their initial universal energy access goals. And with that, the country also adopted what was least cost planning and also integrated, which was essentially to map out where people were and to look at what was the most efficient approach to be able to do that, whether it would be provided by the grid or through bringing the private sector to enable them to either offer things like mini grids and build and develop and operate mini grids, or now what we call the standalone or distributed solutions. So with that policy planning, it really unlocked private sector to be able to know this is my role and make the investment, and they are supported through other instruments like,
Right.
tax policy, fiscal policy, and incentive programs to make it sure that it's affordable and accessible to all the Kenyans.
Mark, you're hearing the different views from South Africa and from Kenya, and how the various African countries are dealing with their energy challenges. What, in your view, though, constitutes the right energy mix for Africa? Which of these energy sources can provide quick turnaround and attract investment?
So when you look at what's being done, it has to be a basket approach. It's not going to be a one size fits all. There's a lot of opportunities. Vincent highlighted, I think, a lot of the key problems. When you look at Eskom sitting at over $26 billion in debt, you have this massive just waste when you look at aging infrastructure. And he brings up a great point of, you have to physically be able to put new electrons onto the grid, and based on the wire line, the generating capacity, you physically don't have that capacity. And then Patrick outlined, I think, something that is going to be a very important piece to the African mix is the decentralized grid, a little bit of that mini grid, because the wire line is expensive. People are typically fairly broad and spaced out, so it'd be very expensive to build that kind of wire line, have that kind of broad distribution. Instead, it's better to bring it directly from the different entities to the source. That can be a mixture of what used to be a stranded asset of natural gas, now starting to become something that is going to be profitable because of the issues within Europe, because of the advent and the European Union trying to bring in new carbon credits and ways to increase their liquidity. It's going to bring cash back down, and bringing the private sector in, saying, you know what, the Kenyan government is going to stand behind this, and then we're going to bring in large corporations to stand behind this as well. So I know my rate of return is covered. You look at South Africa, and there's a certain amount of squandered opportunities. You're fighting inflation, you're fighting rates, and that's why it's going to be a bit more of an uphill battle for South Africa, that has to restructure debt, try to get something that is subsidized, and just create this massive build out to kind of make up, because they're so far behind trying to catch up where Kenya is right now.
Vincent, let's talk about that squandered opportunity and the risks that South Africa's energy sector has, because the energy crisis in South Africa has been 15 years or so in the making. The country's state-owned power company, Eskom, has about $26 billion of debts and old infrastructure that you mentioned earlier on. Are there any significant changes expected in the next few decades, for instance?
Yes, so South Africa is currently a member of the Just Energy Transition Partnership Program with the European Union and the United States. A lot of that money is going to restructure Eskom's debt, as well as bring in renewable capacity onto Eskom. We also have a lot of Eskom power plants looking to see how they can develop renewable energy infrastructure. There's also many moves towards building more grid infrastructure. President Cyril Ramaphosa recently announced the state of disaster on energy and created the position of the Minister of Electricity. Now, for some, it might be a very funny thing, but this minister has the sole responsibility of addressing and dealing with these issues, removing some of the red tape around development of new infrastructure, the development of bringing on independent power producers onto the mix, and all these different aspects. So there are plans over the next 20 years. The question, again, comes back to what both Mark and Patrick have said. How are we going to be able to effectively leverage development finance opportunities, but also how do we effectively leverage policy consistency across administrations, right? Because it's not a one-time thing. Administration can come today with a great idea of what they're going to do. Should it not be continued throughout the 20-year period, it won't be a success.
Right. So, Patrick, we are looking at Kenya here as some sort of leader when it comes to harnessing its renewable energy. You know, are there issues here that can be replicated in other African countries, taking from Kenya's position?
I think it's a fact that your reliance on the grid or one supply on the grid is not going to be the answer. A lot of the utilities across Africa really are not in the strongest place financially, and beyond that, the cost and the investment that's going to be required to bring lines, or as as Mark is calling electrons to everybody, is just enormous, and the money is just not there. However, if you look again at the Kenyan approach, which is whether least cost or really trying to figure out this integrated approach, and look at your planning, look at where people live, look at what is the level of energy access that they need at the point that they are, and what is the smartest solution to do that. I think today you'll find, particularly for most of the off-grid populations, their demand patterns are such that through the standalone solutions, particularly solar home systems and things like that, they can meet the majority of the needs, and you don't need to string any cables, wires. The business models to allow flexible payments are there.
Right.
What's really needed is this adoption and of this integrated approach, and not to look at it as a compromise or a competition to the national utility. Allow the private sector to come and look at how do you keep the products affordable,
right?
And really integrate that. I think today it's very possible to do it, but there's some key policy decisions that need to be made. But just looking just at the grid it will take a lot of money, which is not there, and a lot of time, which we don't have.
So, Mark, we're hearing about a lot of potential for Africa's energy sector, even though there are a myriad of challenges. But then, we keep talking about these statistics coming out of the continent, because according to the African Development Bank, over 600 million people, which is half the population of the continent, have no access to electricity despite an abundance of renewable energy. Why is the continent with the biggest renewable energy potential struggling to meet its energy needs?
Sure. So there's a lot of different pieces to that. So one of the ones is dispatchable energy. How much dispatchable power is available for different regions? And as Patrick outlined, people are far apart. There's a lot of issues getting it from a centralized location because of the amount of wireline it would take to get it to these locations that may be further away from the source, which is why it's so important to have a bit more of a decentralized grid, in the sense of you have more of that local opportunity, and you have to look at what are the needs. What are the needs of the people there? Do they have access to to cooking fuels? Are they going to need electricity for cooking? So there's going to be the amount of demand is also going to fluctuate, and you have to bring in some of those private developers who can be a bit more competitive. As Vincent was talking about, there's a bit more competition. You can bid for different pieces of the grid, and then you can get a certain guaranteed rate of return, which I think would then come back and create a more natural economy, if you will. But as Vincent talked about on the in South Africa,
Right.
a lot of corruption. Copper's worth a lot of money. How do we make sure that people appreciate? Look, we're coming in to build out this economy. We need everybody to participate, and you need that buy-in to ensure that people really build out the grid and protect it as they try to create this opportunity for some of these areas that might be a bit further away from the main point of generation.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll look at some ways Africa's energy resources can be unlocked. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Vincent Obisi-Olu, Patrick Tonui, and Mark Rosano. Before the break, we looked at what Africa's current energy status is. Let's now look at how the continent can unlock its vast, largely untapped energy resources for the future. Mark, we closed off on the question of investment in Africa's energy sector. Where is the private sector? Is there enough private sector participation, and are there incentives here?
So I don't think there's enough private sector involvement yet, but I think that there is a lot that can be done to bring more of it in and guarantee some of the payments. One of the other key things that Patrick mentioned, which I think is really important, is flexible payments. Because if you look at flexible payments, it helps to alleviate some of the pressure from the local. You get some of the backstop, and the government takes on some of that risk. But we all know that there's a certain amount of buy-in coming in. There's people that want to see their region get the electricity that they need. And the fact that it's becoming a bit more affordable when you look at costs coming down, it opens up opportunity. There's a lot of programs through both the UN, the World Bank, where you can get some of the cheaper financing that even though rates have come up, you can still get affordable financing, which then also helps that rate of return. So I do think that there's an opportunity. Then a more developed carbon market and carbon credit market becomes an easier way, because you also create another income stream and revenue stream that can help offset some of your costs.
Vincent, looking at ESCOM's problems and the whole issue of lack of resources there for ESCOM, is there too much government, though, in Africa's energy sector? And is there a balance in participation by other players?
Is there too much government in Africa's energy sector? To some degree, yes. The government does have a significant role to play in creating, developing the rules and making sure rules are abided by and maintained by all actors within the energy market. However, oftentimes what we find in a number of African countries is the government tries to crowd out and be the only show in town, or have its show as the big show in town. And I think what needs to happen, to Mark's point, is there needs to be more private sector participation. Also, government will need to seek out partnerships, greater partnerships with the private sector, as opposed to trying to do it all on its own. This includes governments approaching, as Mark said, for preferential loan agreements, as well as the private sector looking to see how we can approach the de-risking of African energy resources and energy supply, as well as African electrification. Urbanization has happened in a way that is going to continue to happen in Africa, and it's not going to happen in just certain pockets. It's going to be very spread out. In order to meet the requirements of an urbanized African society, you cannot have just one centralized grid.
Right.
The government will need to move away from that and give some to the private sector. Thank you.
Right. Patrick, what's your view here? Do you feel there's too much government in Africa's energy sector, or there is room for others to breathe?
If government comes in and tries or crowds out everybody, I think that's absolutely the wrong thing. And we see that in some places. However, it is also a reality that we need the government to come in the right way. And what do I mean? For example, today, when you look at Africa, right? The perception of risk remains quite high. Interest rates to be able to access to access finance for investment in this space, it remains quite high. And to be able to do something about that will need the right government and the right development support, partner support, if this is going to work. Then secondly, beyond that, if you look at, when we look at universal energy access, those that are still left behind, to be able to provide power to, they are probably those who are the poorest or live in the hardest to reach communities. And without government support in subsidizing that ecosystem, that energy access, the infrastructure and everything else that goes, it's not going to happen. This is something that the technology and the business models are going to be there from the private sector, but the private sector is not in a position to absorb all those costs, and we'll need some of that partnership and support from the government. So the right regulations, the right ecosystem, the right enabling environment that can only be done by government and stakeholders is going to be absolutely important.
Right. So we are looking ahead now, and we're looking at where we are in Africa. Mark, a lot of the challenges in manufacturing and industrialization of the continent is as a result partly of high power costs here. Can African countries really fully develop without access and reliable and affordable energy?
No, it's one of the biggest hurdles that I think many nations face, is trying to create that balance of, you need the stability of the government to come in, but you also need an anchor. Who's going to come in and access the cheaper labor, the well-educated labor. As Vincent talked about, the urbanization of some of these entities, there provides an opportunity for a large corporation to come in, especially when you start hearing those kitschy terms of nearshoring and onshoring, as people look to divest and diversify their supply chains. I think it creates an opportunity to approach some of these larger entities, these larger companies, whether it be Samsung, whether it be, Apple, someone who is a large conglomerate that can come in, and you can create a partnership and say, look, if you build here, we'll provide incentives, we'll provide something, but you're going to buy 60% of the electrical capacity here, and then the other 40% can then be used to diversify and then can supply all of the people that come and work on that level. So there's a certain amount of partnership of government incentives, but at the same time trying to bring that private sector in, creating an anchor, right, and then building around that anchor.
So, there's a lot of lessons here that can be drawn if Africa is to achieve universal access to affordable electricity by 2030. And gentlemen, you've expounded that quite well. Patrick and Vincent, to you both though, can the continent bring connections to 90 million people a year, because that is what is required if the continent is to have universal affordable energy? Can Africa achieve this?
I think as a private sector, absolutely. If you go to some of the work that Google has done, we've actually made a commitment as an industry with a compact under the both our work at COP20, the Conference of Parties process for climate change, and also the UN high-level dialogue of energy, that we believe we as a private sector can bring energy access to 1 billion people by 2030. 590 million of those would be people with new connections, right? But there are some critical things that need to happen. And a lot of it goes to how do we unlock the finance. When we look at our sector, we need about $20 billion a year to come into the sector, and we've only been seeing a fraction, 1/10 of that come in. And if we don't find a way to unlock that investment, either through guarantees or fast loss capital, but if we don't unlock that issue of of unlocking the investment, right? The private sector has the products, has the business know-how, they've got the appetite to go out and make sure that every household, every community that needs a product or needs access to energy can be reached. But we cannot deal with the forex challenges where there's no forex available or currencies are being devaluated. If you cannot import or ship products across from one border to the other, if you're not competitive, you talked about manufacturing, we cannot address that unless the right ecosystem is put in place.
Vincent, your thoughts?
So in South Africa, we have a plan from the Department of Energy on the overview for the universal access to electricity. And it states that to make sure that we reach universal electricity access for formal households, we need adequate capital projects management of this program, including training and skills. We need an implementation timeline in line with the master plan on electricity and power provision. We need to have and solve serious problems and challenges in the electrification space, including the difficult run on electrification programs when network requires serious upgrade. What this is all to say is that it is possible, but it cannot be done on its own by governments alone.
Right.
Government can do only so much. Government can create an enabling environment. There are forex problems and manufacturing challenges and hurdles. The continent itself will need to collaborate in order to make this happen. Initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area can come in combination with attempts such as Samsung coming in, buying up a certain portion of the electricity grid and how much it's going to provide, and then manufacturing certain items on the continent, which will then be exported within the continent's borders, right? And by doing so, countries are able to reduce the amount of tariffs and export tariffs they pay. Free trade bringing and helping to provide electricity for all on the continent.
Mark, you have the final word here. What must be done differently, though, if Africa is to meet its energy demand for the future?
Well, I think some of the key things we've already heard noted is the importance of government backing in terms of, the government creating the stability, but relying on that private sector to bring in that know-how because they can typically do it faster, cheaper, and with a better rate of return. So there's no reason why there can't be a partnership where some of that revenue is shared between everyone that is involved while creating that comfort level. And I think it's also getting more involved in the forwards and futures market, because there's a lot of ways to create some of that stability by issuing forwards to create some of that lockstep, because inflation is a concern. FX and floating rates is a concern. So you can try to buffer that. And then, as Vincent highlighted with the export market, 80 some odd % of the export market is based in dollars. So if you're exporting, importing, you're also going to naturally bring in that flow of US dollars that can create some of that stability, create some of those relationships. I don't think people truly appreciate the opportunity set that is presented. I think there has to be also a little bit better marketing, a little bit better sales on the opportunity that's present in terms of the opportunity to build out, to create the supply chain, to create that network that I think a lot of these countries are in a very good generational cycle when you look at wanting to get better, wanting to increase and improve their standard of living.
Right.
And I think that there's that where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that there's a more collaboration that can be done to really make this achievable by 2030.
Indeed, where there's a will, there's a way, achievable by 2030. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. Vincent Obesi-Olu, Natural Resource Governance Researcher at Good Governance Africa. Patrick Tonui, Head of Policy and Regional Strategy at the Global Association for the Off-Grid Solar Energy Industry. And Mark Rossano, Founder and CEO, C6 Capital Holdings, a multi-sector investment and consulting firm. Well, remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.